So this is going to be a series of videos that is looking at the Greeks, the Persians, and also the Macedonians, who were a Greek-like people, but they did come from outside. They were led by Alexander the Great. So one thing that we should point out before we move on is that we've officially moved into period 2 of AP World History. So these dates are approximately 500 BCE to 500 CE, although those dates are flexible. We also refer to this period as the classical era. One of the reasons why this is because when we get farther on in history, for example, when we talk about the Renaissance in Europe, the classics, if we think of something as classic, it is something that is still revered by future civilizations. In some people's minds, it was seen as one of the pinnacles of civilization. What we'll see is that during the classical era, there were really phenomenal achievements made by these people despite the ancient era that they lived in. The Romans, for example, had indoor plumbing. The Chinese were well regarded for their infrastructure efforts. This is when the Great Wall was constructed. And there were tremendous contributions to intellectual thought. So the Greek philosophers like Socrates and Plato. And additionally, we see some of the most monumental political achievements that will eventually inspire democracies and republican governments in the modern era. So we think of it as classical because there is definitely a connection between this ancient period of history and some of the more modern periods. So keep that in mind. So let's first talk about the geography of the area. So we are talking about the Balkan Peninsula, so an area that juts out into the Aegean and the Mediterranean Sea. You can see just by this map here on the right that there are many islands off the coast of the main peninsula, which means that a lot of these islands are seafaring in nature. They depend on trade for their economic livelihood because they can't get all the natural resources they need. Also, the mainland of Greece, so the peninsula, is very mountainous in nature. So this is just one image of a mountain range in Greece. So this has pros and cons. One of the good things about having a very mountainous terrain is that it was easy to defend from outside invaders. This does not always happen because eventually the Macedonians from the north, led by Alexander the Great, are going to conquer the Greek city-states. But for a long time, the Greeks were well defended just by this natural barrier. One of the difficult things about some of these geographic characteristics was that it was difficult for Greece to unify politically because it was still a very ancient era. It was difficult to design transportation networks across these kinds of geographical barriers, and so therefore communication was difficult. And so you will see that a lot of the Greek city-states develop their own political systems, but still there are ways in which they share a common culture. So just because they are not unified politically does not mean they don't have a common sense of Greekness. And we'll talk about that as time goes on. And the Greeks also thrived because in the valleys and between the mountain regions, the soil was quite fertile. And if they did not live in a fertile area, their trade networks that they developed certainly allowed them to develop a fairly strong economic livelihood. So the first Greek civilizations I want to talk about occurred before the Greek city-states emerged. You can see just by these dates. We are going back to period 1 here. The Minoans were the oldest civilization that lived on the Balkan Peninsula. So they didn't live on the peninsula. They lived on the island of Crete. You see this here. Their most wealthy city was Knossos. And so the Minoans. First off, this island did not have particularly fertile soil, so they relied on trade. And because they were an island, they were able to connect throughout the region. They traded with the Greek mainland, they traded with Phoenicia, they traded with Egypt, and they also traded with Asia Minor, so Turkey, where the Persians were. They also were quite wealthy. We know this because there are archaeological relics. There's evidence that shows that they decorated their homes by painting them, and they had elaborate sculptures. Knossos, for a period, was the wealthiest city on the Aegean Sea. But we do have limits to how much we know about the Minoans. For example, we don't have any writing system that has been deciphered from the Minoans. So we actually rely on some information that came about from later in Greek history about the Minoans. So we don't know exactly how accurate that is. But what we do know is that there was archaeological evidence throughout the Mediterranean that suggests that there was an influence from the island of Crete that spread throughout the Mediterranean region as early as 2000 BCE or so. So we know that Crete was quite wealthy and they were able to share a lot of their culture with the surrounding civilizations. The wealth of the Minoans, their skill as builders, and their experience as seafarers gave rise to many well-known myths. One of the most common was the legendary king Minos, which is where the Minoans get their name. Minos was, according to legend, the son of Zeus and Europa, so he descended from Greek gods. The legend was also that he was the oldest man in history to build a navy. And he also allegedly built what were called labyrinths or mazes to contain this Minotaur, who was a half bull, half man. You probably have seen a Minotaur before. This is an image of him, and this is the Minotaur in the middle of the labyrinth. So essentially, mythology helps the Minoan civilization live on. Another Minoan myth was the myth about Daedalus, who was the father of Icarus. You may remember that Icarus was the man who flew too close to the sun and his wings melted and he died. So a good example of hubris. Now, Daedalus was the one who allegedly created the labyrinth to contain the Minotaur. So the Minoans, again, we have a lot of examples that show that they were rich in culture as well as just economically. We have artistic renderings of women demonstrating their social status through fashion. They curled their hair, for example. They wore expensive jewelry that was made from gold and also other items that had to be imported from outside of Greece. They had knowledge of metallurgy because they used it in their fashion. They wore metal belts, for example, and they had an elaborate social life. They liked to dance, they engaged in sporting events, so that's a good precursor to the Olympic Games of the more modern Greek city-states. But the Minoans do not last forever. There are a few theories as to why they collapsed. Some of them are natural or environmental in theory. There is one theory that is very popular by archaeologists that there was a tidal wave, actually, that washed over the Minoan civilization and destroyed cities. So this is just an artistic rendering of a tidal wave washing over this civilization. There was also a theory that the Mycenaeans, who we're going to talk about next, who lived on the Greek mainland, attacked and invaded the Minoans. They did not necessarily conquer them, but they weakened them enough so that their civilization did not last. And also, first off, we already know that the Minoans did not have very fertile soil, but in an effort to try to develop some agriculture, they cut down the trees that were on the island, which contributed to deforestation, which eventually made it so that the island was no longer inhabitable. So the Mycenaeans, the next ancient pre-Greek city-state civilization. The Mycenaeans were from the mainland, so we see just comparing the locations of these two pre-Greek city-state civilizations. The Mycenaeans were around a little bit after the Minoans, so they originated around 1600 BCE and stayed around until about 1100 BCE. So they, first off, had many parts of the Minoan culture in their own culture. So there was definitely evidence to suggest the Minoans and the Mycenaeans were in contact with one another, even if it was violent in nature. So there are some theories that there were fights, that the Mycenaeans invaded the Minoans. We don't have strong evidence to suggest that they conquered the Minoans, but we do know that they had many artifacts from the Minoans, and they were influenced by their culture. They worshiped the same gods, for example, and they also developed some of the same technological skills. So they became skilled in metalworking, shipbuilding, and they also learned how to use the sun and stars to navigate on the seas. And these are all things that people think they got from the Minoans. They also were a seafaring and trading-based economy. So there are examples of items that definitely did not originate in the Mycenaean area that the Mycenaeans had. So they had things like ivory and amber that could have come from places like Syria, for example, and maybe even places like Egypt. And we also know that there was some cultural syncretism in the sense that the Mycenaeans actually intermarried with the people that already lived in that area. So people that were called Hellenes, and we're going to talk about the origin of that word. It technically means Greek, and this allowed them to set up small kingdoms in this area. We have examples also of well, first off, let's talk a little bit about how the Mycenaeans declined, and then we'll talk about the continuation of their culture. So there was a dark age that originated around 1100 BCE and lasted until about 700 BCE. And after that dark age declined, we're going to see that the Greek city-states emerge. There, again, are some theories. It happened so long ago that we're not positive as to exactly what happened to cause the Mycenaeans to decline, but some of the theories. One of them is that Greek native peoples called the Dorians invaded and conquered the Mycenaeans and replaced their society. There are also theories that there was some internal unrest, so potentially there were people that actually revolted against their leadership. We also know that there was an economic decline. Trade essentially ceased. We also see that people started to lose some of their economic skills, and poverty increased. So what's interesting, though, is that despite the fact that the Minoan and Mycenaean cultures eventually declined, we still see that there are examples of the continuation in their culture throughout the Mediterranean region and eventually in the Greek city-states. So some examples that show us the continuation of this culture. First off, their artistic style. They painted in a style called fresco. We see that down here below. This is actually a fresco painting that was in modern-day Israel. So we see that the Minoan influence actually spread quite a long distance. This is an example of jewelry that came from the Minoan civilization that was made out of gold. And these were statuettes, so small statues that came from the Minoans and the Mycenaeans. They both made these statuettes. And we found these throughout the Mediterranean region and Southwest Asia, and even in parts of Europe. So we see that despite the fact that these civilizations declined, they still reached out and influenced many subsequent civilizations. So let's talk briefly about the early city-states before we get to the bread and butter of the city-states with Sparta and Greece. So in general, the Greek city-states start to emerge partly because their economy is going to recover from the Dark Ages. So around 750 BCE or so, the Dark Ages are going to end. Again, as we already discussed, the geography of the Greek peninsula and the islands made it so that they had to trade. They did not have access to all the natural resources that they needed. So what we're going to see is that the Greeks started to travel on Mediterranean sea lanes. They transported things like grain, timber, gold, and other metals from one point to another. And they also served as the conduit. So sometimes they would be sort of the middleman in trade networks. So say something was coming from a place like Egypt and they wanted to transfer it further east. They also became wealthy because they could be in the middle of this trade. We also see that they were influenced by cultures from outside of their own. One of the most prominent examples, and one that affects our culture even today, is that the Greeks actually adopted the Phoenician alphabet. And so this made reading and writing easier and created more efficient communication across cultures. You can see that they're not exactly the same, but the Phoenician alphabet, we do see similarities between the characters that they used, and these were all characters that represented sounds, so you didn't need as many characters. You could contrast that with things like cuneiform and Chinese characters, for example. And we see how it evolves into the Greek alphabet eventually, and then we see our modern alphabet that evolved from the Greek and Roman alphabet. So this is important because we can actually trace our language origins all the way back to these trade connections. So the city-states start to emerge. Another word that you will occasionally see that also means city-state is a polis. Okay, so just in case you ever come across that in reading, that's what it is. Okay, you see that there were a series of poli, or polis, I don't know how to say that in plural, that emerged throughout the Greek city-states. These were some of the most prominent ones. And so a city-state was the city and the surrounding area. And it developed its own unique political structure. So they all governed themselves independently, but they sometimes shared cultural connections with other city-states. So sometimes the city-states were allies with one another. Sometimes they were enemies with one another. It really depended on the political nature of the time. We'll talk about some of those instances more. But what we see is essentially, again, because of the geography of Greece, it was very difficult for them to develop a united political system, so the polis developed instead. So this is a sort of general discussion, but the typical polis was one that was made up of citizens, right? Citizens are not the entire population. It's important for us to realize that. Citizens were people who could participate in government. So essentially what we see is that citizens were people who first off could vote, so they were debating on major issues. They also were ones that could represent themselves in court. They could own property. But one exchange was very important for the citizens. They were supposed to, in turn, because they could vote, because they could speak about major issues in their city-state, they had to return the favor, so to speak, to their city-state. So one of the expectations among citizens was for them to serve in the military, for example. Now, what we do see is that not all people, I don't have that written down, but not all people in the Greek city-states were citizens. Some of the most important exceptions, of course, women were not citizens. Only free men were citizens. So that also meant that slaves and people who were born outside of the Greek city-states could not be citizens. And again, as I was saying earlier, military service was a requirement from citizens, so the polis could call on citizens to defend their lands in their infantry, and sometimes this meant that they were fighting against other city-states. Before we get to the evolution of Greek democracy with Athens, we need to discuss other types of governments that existed in the Greek city-states. So in the earliest years of the Greek city-states, monarchies were prevalent. So monarchy is pretty straightforward. It's where one king or monarch is going to rule the city-state. Right? This is going to make it so that it is less representative in nature. People have less of a say in a monarchy, typically. Then eventually we are going to evolve into an oligarchy. An oligarchy is the rule by a few. So normally you had wealthy landowners, basically nobles, sometimes merchants, people who had money, therefore power, who would rule collectively. Oligarchies were pretty common before we see the evolution of democracy. Once the social structure becomes more complex, we do see that oligarchies also fall out of favor, partly because there's going to be this new middle class that emerges that starts to resent the aristocracy. They don't like the idea that the aristocracy is basically restricting their own rights. So eventually we also see a period where we have what we call tyranny. And tyrants were basically leaders that were chosen by popular support. We could think of someone like Julius Caesar as a tyrant. And we know that he's Roman, but essentially he was someone that emerged to political power because people believed he would be a good leader. So some tyrants were seen as very fair rulers because they were selected by the people. Others were seen as cruel and unjust. And because some of the later tyrants were not seen as very good, we do see democracy evolve in certain city-states. And just as an acronym for us to remember the order with which these political structures evolve, we could say move on to democracy, or we could say monarchy, oligarchy, tyranny, and democracy. Just so you know, sometimes they refer to an aristocracy stage of rule as well, which is similar to oligarchy, so I did not include that there. Okay, so we're going to stop with this first video, and we'll pick up with the second video that talks about the nature of Athens and Sparta. So stay tuned for that one, and thank you.